Hi everyone, this is Brian Kling, the Global Technical Lead for the Civil Products with Autodesk Product Support. Coming to you again this month with our webcast, and the topic for this month is on understanding performance. So as an overview, we're going to look at performance and how it's affected by three main components. One of them being your memory, another one being the operating system, and the other being characteristics of the software. So as an overview, we're going to cover topics such as physical versus virtual memory. We'll talk about 32 and 64-bit and how that applies not only to applications but also to operating systems. Then we'll talk a little bit about XP and Vista, and we'll answer a question a bit later on about Windows 7, as I'm sure some of you are wondering. Then we'll also talk about some performance tweaks, and we'll follow it up with some frequently asked questions. So let's go on to part one and let's talk about memory. So we really have two kinds of memory. The first kind is the physical memory. So I think most people are familiar with this. That's called RAM. It's hardware based. So these are memory chips that you plug into your motherboard. So when you go to buy a computer, you configure you configure it with your desired amount of RAM and you buy that. If you want to add more RAM, you have to buy more RAM chips, and then you have to have some slots available on your motherboard in order to plug those in. So that's all hardware. It's physical hardware. Okay. The second kind of memory is called virtual memory. And what virtual memory is a combination of the RAM, the hardware capacity, as well as the operating system allows you to use some of your free hard disk space to augment the amount of memory that you can use. Okay, so a lot of times this virtual portion is also called page or swap files. Okay, so let's just talk about paging here for a second. So paging is actually where you take pieces of memory that you parse into chunks, and they're called pages, and then you write them to the hard disk. Okay, and this is a process that occurs while the application is open, things are running, so it's writing on and off of the hard disk in these page files. Okay, and the key thing to remember here, because we're going to talk about this later, is that these page files can be non-contiguous. So what that means is when they're stored or placed on your hard drive for that session, so while your computer's running, and then they're taken off when you're finished, but while they're put when they're put on your hard drive, they don't have to be contiguous. They don't have to be next to each other in the sectors on the boot disk, okay, or on the hard disk. Normally in the settings, you let the operating system handle the size of this of the page or swap files, but you can hard configure that. You can tweak that. So we're not going to go into that, but that's something that you are able to do. And then the other thing just to remember is the more physical RAM that's used, it does give you better performance because it doesn't have to write to disk, etc. So that was our brief spiel on the RAM. I just wanted to make sure you had a solid understanding of those two types of memory, the RAM and virtual memory, and how that works. This second part, we're going to talk about 32 and 64-bit. And first we'll talk about it as it applies to software. So, as you know already, Civil 3D is a 32-bit application. We don't have a 64-bit version yet. Okay. However, we can install this 32-bit application on a 64-bit operating system. That is possible. Okay. There's some people that are a little confused about that, but yes, it is possible. Now, one thing to remember is that a 32-bit application cannot address more than 4 gigabytes of virtual memory, regardless of whether it's a 32 or a 64-bit operating system. Now the default, and here this is the default for a 32-bit system, operating system. Normally out of the box, when you just run things without configuring or tweaking anything, 2 gigabytes of virtual memory will be for the application to run, and 2 gigabytes will be reserved for operating system processes that have to occur while the application is running. Okay, so that's why when you have 2 gigs of RAM on a 32-bit operating system, you have that 2 gigabytes available, and then it's got 4 gigs of virtual memory that it's working with. Okay, so one thing to remember is Civil 3D is large address aware. So that means it can utilize up to 3 gigabytes of virtual memory for the application. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit later about tweaking that setting a little bit. Okay, and then just one other thing I want to bring up is video cards can also affect memory usage. Some video cards, the drivers, can actually have some effect on how much memory is available. And also there are some video cards that actually are designed to grab some virtual memory to help them run better. So that's just something to remember. You'd want to review the characteristics of your graphics cards to understand fully what impact they might have on your performance. And then a final point here is any applications that you want to work with Civil 3D, because it's only a 32-bit application currently, they must also be 32-bit applications. So this would come into play, for example, if you were to install raster design to work with Civil 3D, if you're installing object enablers to work with Civil 3D, or hotfixes. In some cases there are options for the hotfixes in 64 or 32-bit. So you want to remember to always select a 32-bit option. Okay. So we talked about Civil 3D itself. Right now, as I've said several times, it's a 32-bit only application at this time. So now let's talk about the operating system itself, which comes in a 32-bit and a 64-bit flavor. So here quickly is the recommended operating system to use with Civil 3D in the decreasing order of preference. So the first item in the list is the most desirable, which is Windows Vista 64-bit. Next in line is XP 64-bit. So 64-bit in general is going to give you the best performance, and then it goes down from there, and we'll describe that a little bit further. So Vista does handle memory a little better than XP, but 64-bit is still better than 32-bit, and that's why in the list you saw, let me go back again, notice once again we have Vista 64-bit and then XP 64-bit. The gain in that 64-bit operating system is still better than the 32. Okay. Another thing is a 64-bit operating system can actually give a 32-bit application a full 4 gigabytes of virtual memory usage. So remember, before we talked about the default for a 32-bit operating system is that 2 gigabytes are reserved for the operating system processes and 2 gigabytes are used for the application. A 64-bit operating system, if you have more RAM than 4 gigabytes, so more RAM overall, it's going to be able to allow the application to actually grab that full 4 gigabytes. Now here's the caveat, okay, or here's the other side of it. As a 32-bit application, even on a 64-bit operating system, you're never going to see the operating system giving a full 4 gigs to the application, and that's because of the non-contiguous paging files. Okay, so I have a graphic here just to compare it. So it's similar to, you've all run defrag on your disks, I'm sure, right? So you're familiar with the graphic here we have in the middle where it shows you contiguous files in blue, and then there's fragmented files in red and unmovable files, and the white area is the free space. Well, the same kind of thing happens when you're running an application as far as utilizing virtual memory and swap files on the hard disk, etc. Is that when it writes those files and things like that, it doesn't put them all together in one chunk and compact them as perfectly as it could, and that's really a characteristic of the operating system itself. That's not something that we can control to a high degree. So what happens is, as it writes page files in, there are gaps, and some of these gaps are not big enough to be utilized by the virtual memory. So that's why normally what we've seen is with a 64-bit operating system, about the max you'll hit will be about 3.2 gigabytes can be utilized for the application, somewhere around there. Okay, so that's just trying to give you a better visual to understand why you can't reach that full memory limit. Now, having a lot more than 4 gigabytes of RAM on a 64-bit operating system will not significantly increase your performance of Civil 3D. Okay, and that's because, once again, it's a 32-bit application, so it can't go beyond those 3.2 gigabytes we just talked about, right? So even if your 64-bit operating system, you could pump it up with 128 gigabytes of RAM, but if you compared say having 12 gigabytes of RAM to 128, you're really not going to see Civil as an application running any faster, okay? Because it's just limited in how much virtual memory it can actually utilize to try and perform better, okay? So one other thing to say, though, is on a 64-bit operating system, your overall system performance can improve if you have more RAM. And that's because most of us, I think, we don't run just one application at a time. Now, if you run high-end apps and you have several of them open, then you should notice a performance boost, of course, if you're on a 64-bit operating system and you have a decent amount of RAM. Because with those other applications running as well, then they're not going to be sharing 4 gigs, but maybe they're sharing 8 or 12 gigs or something like that. So you will find better overall performance. I'm just saying within the performance of Civil 3D itself, you won't see a great gain beyond that 4 gigabytes. So here, just to review the characteristics between the 32-bit operating system and a 64-bit. So let's look at the first line. So first of all, Civil 3D as a 32-bit application can be installed on both of these operating systems. The next line here, we have the theoretical maximum virtual memory that can be utilized. On a 32-bit operating system, we mentioned that the default is 2 gigabytes. However, we have what's called a 3 gigabyte switch. And what that does is it forces the operating system to give up 1 gigabyte of virtual memory and give it back to the application. So the application then uses 3 gigabytes and the operating system is limited to 1 gigabyte. Now in the 64-bit OS, the theoretical maximum virtual memory limit is 4 gigabytes, once again for a 32-bit application. So on the next line, we get to the nitty-gritty of what we're actually talking about. So a realistic amount of virtual memory that we can be using. Sometimes you'll find the 3 gigabyte switch works fine by itself. But there's one more switch that you can use so that you can actually tweak how much of that gigabyte you're giving to the application. If you enable the 3 gigabyte switch and you find that it's hitting you in other ways, so it's just not you're having problems with the performance at that point, then I'd recommend you try the user VA switch as well. What that does is tells the operating system literally how much virtual memory it can give back to the application. So you can say, well, a whole full gigabyte is a little bit too much. I only want you to have, say, 800 megabytes, something like that. So you can look on our knowledge base. We have knowledge base articles on how to set the 3 gig switch and the user VA switch. So for a 32-bit operating system, that's kind of what you're looking at here, is a maximum of 3 gigabytes to be used, but maybe and possibly less than that is going to give you the best overall performance. For a 64-bit operating system, as we talked about before, typically even with those full 4 gigabytes allotted to the application, because of the non-contiguous page files, etc., you're really going to probably be limited to somewhere around 3.2 gigabytes of virtual memory usage for the application. However, once again, a 64-bit operating system still is going to give you the better performance overall. And then large address aware, we talked about that. That's a characteristic of the software. It's large address aware. So on a 32-bit operating system, that allows it to use the 3 gigabyte switch. On a 64-bit operating system, because it has that characteristic of being large address aware, then the 64-bit operating system can automatically give it the rest of that virtual memory, because that's the characteristic it's looking for if it's large address aware. Okay, so hopefully that gives you a little bit better understanding of what the options are, as well as what the limitations are, and how that all works together. Okay, on part 4 here, we're going to just review a couple of tweaks we can do to help the performance. So first off, I would recommend, if you haven't seen this, go to the help pull down in Civil 3D, and you'll see what's called a best practices guide. It's also located in the contents and the help, so you can search for it. But that has a lot of good tips as far as best use of the product. I would really recommend, if you haven't reviewed that, to have a read on that and to train your users in some of these tricks. Okay. Then, as we mentioned before, we have the 3 GB switch, which we can enable when we're on a 32-bit operating system. You don't need to do this with 64-bit, remember. This is just for 32-bit operating systems. And then you can fine-tune that with the user VA switch, which will once again allow you to not give a full gigabyte back to the application, but actually limit it a little bit more. Because sometimes we found that the operating system needs a bit more than a gigabyte to run efficiently. Okay. Then we also have a solution on our knowledge base about unloading the map components. So if you find that you're using Civil 3D and you're really not using the map functions very often, what you can do is set up a desktop shortcut where you can turn it off, so that when you start up Civil 3D, it will not load all of the map functionality. Now, in that solution, it also describes if you use map just once in a while, you can still turn it off by default, and then during a drawing session you can still type in a command and enable map to run, but then the next time you start Civil, it'll still be disabled. Okay, but we give you the option of the 2 desktop shortcuts, one that will turn that functionality off and one that turns it back on. And then another option as well is, if you're not using Vault at all, if you uninstall the Vault client, that will also save you, I believe, around 80 to 85 megabytes. So that could also help out some. Okay, so those are some performance tweaks that can help if you're finding you have issues with their performance while you're running Civil 3D. Now let's finish up with a few frequently asked questions. Some of these I've already addressed, but we'll just address them directly here as well, just to review once more. Okay. When will we have a 64-bit version of Civil 3D? I'm sure that's a burning question for everyone. Well, I can't give you an explicit answer at this time. However, I can certainly tell you it's in the works. Most of our other Autodesk applications do have a 64-bit version, so we should see that sooner rather than later. I can't really say more than that, but because we're dependent on AutoCAD and Map, we had to make sure they had their 64-bit up and running before we could offer ours. So believe me when I say that it is coming, but I can't tell you exactly when. What about Windows 7? So we've all heard about Windows 7. It's scheduled for release in October of this year. However, I think you can appreciate that we cannot test our products and support them on a beta version of an operating system, right? So yeah, it's just going to be at your own discretion. If you want to try Windows 7 with Civil 3D, you're welcome to, of course, but we are not going to be able to support that if you call in with problems and are asking for a support request. We can't support you on Windows 7 until it's tested. So, once again, I can't give you a date exactly when, but if you're looking at buying new systems now and you're a little bit concerned about what operating system should I get now, and what if we go to Windows 7 later, what if we're going to support it? Well, a lot of times now we're close enough so that a lot of the vendors, if you buy computers now, you can go ahead, definitely get a 64-bit system and go ahead and put Vista on it, and then you'll typically have either a free or quite a reduced price upgrade when Windows 7 comes out, and you can wait until we support it. Okay, so I kind of answered this question. I'm upgrading, what should I buy? So as I said, definitely a 64-bit operating system. I would get more RAM, kind of anticipating that we should have a 64-bit version. Once again, I'm not going to promise you when, but it doesn't hurt if you're getting a machine now. You don't really want to have to continue to upgrade it in the future. So definitely get the 64-bit operating system. I would recommend somewhere around 8 gigabytes of RAM. You can pump it up more if you wish. Once again, if you're running a lot of memory intensive applications, you may want to consider that if you want to keep them running concurrently, okay, all at the same time. And then once again, I just wanted to remind you again, if you're getting a new system or upgrading some components in your system, you definitely want to review the characteristics of your graphics card just to understand, is it a graphics card that's actually grabbing some of that virtual memory to run better? Do the drivers have some load on the memory? Things like that, okay? So Task Manager never shows Civil 3D using all my virtual memory. Why? We get this question now and then. You can go into Task Manager. If you can't see the virtual memory allocation, you can click on the pull downs in the Task Manager and add that to the columns, so the things that you can see in there. As I explained before, it's because of these page files, right? They're non-contiguous. So in the best of all possible worlds, the operating system would pack everything down tight in one spot when it's utilizing this memory. However, it doesn't do that, so we have gaps in there, and if the gaps aren't up to a certain limit, then they're not able to be used, okay, for the virtual memory for the application. So that's why you're never going to see, as I mentioned before, like on a 64-bit operating system, even though Civil as a 32-bit can utilize up to 4 gigabytes, you'll never see it utilizing the full amount, okay? So but you'll still get maybe 3.2 somewhere in there, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. So there we go. Page files are non-contiguous, so you get those gaps that can't be utilized by the application. All right, that's what I have for this month. I hope you've enjoyed it, or at least understand it better. That's always our goal in product support, not only to help you with issues, but also to help you understand better how to work with the application. So I'll sign off for now and look forward to another video next month. Thanks.